So, what I discovered is that life is a story within a story within a story. So, that's the framework basically of life and the narrative framework of how we are operating in this life. And I think that consciousness is the closest that we're going to come to understanding that we live in that story within the story within the story within the story. Okay? Those are the only like two ideas that I actually wrote down. And I also think that like words, images, narratives, anything that we can relate that information and that experience are tools from our consciousness to explain that we are awake and aware of the story within the story that's constantly unraveling. Okay? So let's explain that a little bit better. So if I believe that life is a story within a story within a story, then basically me as a character, I'm a story in a character. But now you might ask yourself, okay, but you're a real person. This is not a story. Like if you're choosing actions to do today, they're going to reflect in the world tomorrow, and they're going to, consequently reflect you and the people around you. Yeah, correct. And I do believe that to be true as well. But I do believe that every story that has been realized or even unrealized is real. It can be imagined and real at the same time. So the way to explain this better is that you have your consciousness, you have your memories, you have every little bit of experience and knowledge that you've accumulated throughout your life, and you're going to accumulate more as you go through life. And now with all that, so you're watching this in the year of 2025. So if I tell you, I don't know why these are the examples that I come up with, but if I tell you Princess Diana, Game of Thrones, and Michael Jackson, more often than not, depending your age, you will have for sure heard of these three things, because these three things have lived in our collective consciousness. Now, further to explain, Princess Diana and Michael Jackson are real people. They have been real people in our world, right? But Game of Thrones is an invented story, right? Okay, this is where it gets a bit more complex, or maybe not complex, but as I said, that's the way I see things, and I believe this to be true. So say you're a person, okay, living in this world, and you're watching Game of Thrones, or you're reading Game of Thrones, and one of the most popular characters in the world that we know of is Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. I've only watched the first 1-2 seasons of Game of Thrones, and I only read the first 2 books, so we're gonna go with Jon Snow, because from what I know, he's pretty much there the whole way through. No spoilers for Game of Thrones. I still wish to finish the series both in book and TV show format. Now, Jon Snow is operating in the paradigm of Game of Thrones, right? Which was created by George R.R. Martin and then later created by a TV crew for the shows. So Jon Snow has one way to operate, and he has, his way to operate and his characteristic as a character, right? And the thing is, unless something came to really trouble Jon Snow's consciousness in his element, in his story setting, which is like a high fantasy medieval concept story, right? Game of Thrones, that's how we see it. It's an imagined world with dragons. So if you were, to suddenly implant your memories, and your memories, like your life experiences, the people you loved, the people you hated, the books that you've read, all the way from maybe like antiquity to 2025, the new releases that you read last week, a new book that came out, the new Susan Collins Hunger Game books, okay? Imagine you implemented those memories from you and these new experiences and these new real and imagined stories, real and imagined people, and you planted that into Jon Snow's consciousness in his story of Game of Thrones. Okay. The next day, he would wake up and he would technically be declared insane by the people around him, because we understand that they wouldn't know Princess Diana, they wouldn't know Michael Jackson, and they wouldn't personally know you and your stories and your experiences, and the fact that, you know, you live in 2025 where we have AI and like technology at our fingertips, right? So he would just be crushed, right? He would literally be insane, deemed insane by the people around him. But his reality is real, right? You planted those memories in his reality, right? That's the new Jon Snow story in Jon Snow's mind. So he is living as Jon Snow. Everything he's known has now shifted and changed with everything you've known, and he doesn't know who you're coming from, he doesn't know who you are, and why he has these memories, and why he knows about Michael Jackson, Princess Diana, and the new Hunger Game books, for example, okay? The idea here is that, okay, but Jon Snow is not real. So even if you were to do that hypothetical exercise, then, you know, it's just a hypothetical. We could have so many different exercises like this where we're just implementing different people's consciousness on real or imagined people. Correct. But I do believe that the fact that it can exist and that it's real, and like, for example, I just planted this idea in your head right now, that doesn't make it unreal. Like right now, there is a Jon Snow out there with like collective memory and different memory from a person that we've planted into, and he's going crazy and he's not fitting into the Jon Snow narrative. By the Jon Snow narrative, I mean the one he's originally assigned as Jon Snow, the character with Jon Snow actions in Jon Snow memories in a high fantasy dragon story called Game of Thrones, which originally created by George R. R. Martin in his consciousness and then realized by a whole TV production and cast as we know it today. And that's why I think that we are all real and imagined at the same time, and it sort of makes a difference, but it sort of does not make any difference at all. Okay, let me explain it in a more realistic, concrete setting. If you're to go to someone that you're close with and you know exactly their pattern of speech, you know exactly how they think, you know their fondest memory or the most traumatic event in their life, I guarantee you that with images that you plant in their head by the patterns of speech or behaviors that you exhibit around them, you can literally cause them, you know, great agony or great, happiness, okay? And this is like what storytellers do, right? The reason why we craft stories and we add elements that will make, for example, the readers or the consumers cry or, feel connected is because we can tap into that. We can tap into those frameworks. So say if I had a friend and she's afraid of heights, okay? If I tell her, okay, I am going to bring you out for your birthday, okay? And I make this whole ordeal and I set it up in a way where she's very happy, she's very excited, and then, I blindfold her and then I bring her, and then the moment that she is awake, okay, or like the moment that she's back to seeing the world around her, and she's in a simulation where she's high up in the ground, okay? How do you think she's gonna feel? She's gonna feel fear, right? And she doesn't know that she's in a simulation. Maybe I put VR goggles on her, okay? And she doesn't know she's in a simulation. So she thinks that the moment that someone pushes her, she's gonna fall into like, 10 miles down on the ground. When it's not real, okay? And you push her and she has that instinctive feeling, those are real to her, okay? Sure, later on, a few hours later, she'll never talk to you again, she'll be mad, she'll be angry, but she will recount that as feeling real, and everyone's gonna invalidate her and her feelings, right? And her patterns of thinking because it was VR, like virtually, virtual, reality induced. And I believe this is exactly why consciousness and storytelling are both linked, and I think that's what makes us understand that we are a story within a story within a story. Okay, let me give you 2 examples from commonly known movies. First one obviously is The Matrix, and I didn't like The Matrix, the movie. I mean, I think it's because it's something that I've known and I've heard about so many times that when I watched it I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, But I can understand how when the Matrix was made, how many people were like, oh wait, what? Wow, like this is revolutionary, because it was and it is, right? Even when I try to explain this to people that are not as story oriented or have not really thought about story narratives or how we see frameworks in story, the first thing they'll be like, oh, are you trying to explain to me the Matrix? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess, yeah, if that's what makes sense to you. Another moment in movies that I loved, this one I loved because I had read the books, it's that moment where in Divergent, where Four and Tris, which they're both Divergent, I mean, spoiler like alert, but it's been what, over 10 years now, and Four and Tris are like resistant to that like serum, okay, and they're not going to live in that simulation where they're under control of, you know, the leaders and going to cause chaos and kill like everyone they've known and loved in abnegation, I believe. So it's that moment where they're both conscious, right? And you as the watcher, you're also conscious. So it's like it clicks, you understand them, and you feel that horror of them being the only conscious too. That exact horror and fear is what we feel on a very intense spiritual level in our lives at a certain time. It could be from real or imagined fear, and it's I think it pulls down to, now this is a different section, and I will probably take more time to think about this and make future videos to link all my thoughts, because this is just like one facet of a million that I've been thinking about. And it's that in the end, it's that fear that you wake up as Jon Snow, okay, with all the memories and all the consciousness and no one to understand it, right? Like it's like the Salem witch trials, you know, like it's that we're burning people that have a different view of things, a different story, a different consciousness, right? But the thing is, and I'm going to use insanity very loosely here, the words that I'm using here are words for you to understand the way that I'm framing things, but they're not always 100% the way that we accurately use the words in our society. So insanity, I'm using this in a way where like you have too much consciousness and the world around you believes that you're in the wrong, because there's no way that you can have this consciousness and that you're imagining, either you're willfully imagining these things and trying to disrupt the society around you, or you're just unconsciously imagining these things, and which harms you and the society around you. So that's how I'm framing insanity as. So I think at certain moments in your life, you will have those moments of extreme consciousness, okay? And it will rip you away and separate you from everything that you've ever known. And it's not a permanent separation, but it can be in the more extreme cases, but it can be very temporal. And the other thing that I realized is that this separation is another proof that we're living within a story, within a story, within a story. Because say you read Frankenstein, okay? Frankenstein is a story recounting another story in letters about a story, right? And then on top of that, you know that it was written and penned by Mary Shelley, and on top of that, you know that you are a reader of Mary Shelley for 200, 300 years later. So, and then if you dig deeper than that, the Mary Shelley story of Frankenstein is based on the myth of Prometheus in some ways. And then if you know what I mean, if you keep digging, everything is connected, right? Every little thing is connected. Everything has been said and done at the same time that it has been said and done. So every story, real or imagined, has always been real or imagined at the same time. So this is what I think that we as humans, now this is the next level. The level is that we are humans, so we have human level limitations to consciousness and how we understand consciousness. Some people have more understanding of consciousness, while others have lower levels of awareness of consciousness. I think this is very much up for debate. It's very hard to say who's more conscious than another, because like we have not really put our finger on consciousness as much as we like to talk about consciousness. And this is how I see consciousness. I see it and I believe it to be true through the facet of storytelling. Okay. I fear that I'm gonna have to refilm this video and reframe my thoughts a few more times before this gets like more clear in the way that I'm seeing it, because right now I'm just talking in the way that I remember seeing it. I will definitely be posting this one and then re-uploading at some point, maybe, you know, after I feel more, not confident, but more clear with the wording that I want to use and the framing of how I see things. What did I talk about? I talked about this fear of insanity when you have too much consciousness. Now, why I wanted to talk about this is because I've been a person that had my, let's say, you know, when you go through traumatic experiences, I think that's one of the ways where consciousness can be disruptive. Like, it's one of the ways where consciousness can be disrupted and you reevaluate everything. Another good way to explain it is betrayal. You ever watch a movie and you didn't know that the character is going to be betrayed, and then they get betrayed, and you're putting everything back from what you've known about the movie and the character into narrative order in your head to understand how this betrayal came about. Sometimes as a reader or as a watcher, you already know that the character is going to be betrayed before the character knows, but you could feel sympathetic for the character because they're about to get betrayed, and you know how you have to watch afterward how the character is trying to puzzle piece everything together in their like frame of thinking to understand how did this betrayal happen. You know, like when you think you know someone for X amount of years and then they betray you so severely and so uniquely towards you that you have to basically reevaluate everything. And I think people that have been abused or through traumatic experiences have to go through that kind of like lightning moment of consciousness where it's like, wait a minute, let me reevaluate everything I've ever known up until this point. And this is why it can be so distressing. What if you wake up at like 75 and like at this point you should have had like a few moments of like deep consciousness and deep pattern rethinking and reorganizing and reframing of your own story and the story of the people around you and the story of the society around you. So it can be very, very lonely, okay? And this is why I think also as a society we decide not to share certain things with children, not to make them aware of certain things, because too much consciousness too soon of certain things can be very disruptive in the natural flow of like consciousness. You know, like I said, too much of it, you become that insane Jon Snow character that gains all that memory that he cannot do anything about in his world, for example. Okay, so now I want to talk about loneliness, depression, anxiety, and all the, you know, things that we have been taught are the negative emotions, and those are the things that can, you know, lead you to self-harm, sabotage, and in extreme cases, suicide, okay? I think, and this is not 100%, this is through this framework that I'm working through right now with consciousness and storytelling, and I'm using myself as an example, as someone who's suffered through that. When I had those intense feelings and those actions and patterns and behavior, I had a story about myself. I had a story about my identity, and I had a story about my life and the way I see my life, and I have my expectation and then I have the reality of what's real, right? Let's say my expectation is not really an expectation, it's more of an imagination, okay? So you have imagination, you have reality, right? You have me, right? I'm a real person, I'm Sandra, and then you have imagination, I'm the Sandra I wish to be, right? If there's a large gap, what does that mean? That means suffering, that means unfulfillment, that means emptiness, that means depression, that means, you know, how come these are not matching up, you know, how come this is here and this is here, and then, you know, the more you're aware of that gap, it can become like this, right? So here's me and here's my imagination, and all this, okay, this is like unfulfilled potential. This is like, I cannot imagine myself in a different person, or if I can imagine myself as a different person, I cannot reach that as a real person. So I think this is how we end up with these narratives that we tell ourselves that make us depressed, right? And obviously, again, coming back, it's not all imagined, it's real. You know, like if someone hurts me, if I've been abused since I was a child, for example, or if I've been in this pattern of self-sabotage and self-harm, which I have been for many, many years, many, many decades, then how is it possible to overcome that? You know, how is it possible to change? Because, you know, at some point we assume that we are just operating on a pattern, or it's like something going on with the brain, and, you know, how can we overcome that, right? And I think, again, this is not the case, but it's that you need enough self-awareness to understand the human limitation and your imagination. But if you have too much awareness to understand that you're never going to reach those two in a perfect equilibrium, what you end up feeling is despair, depression. It's kind of like a paradox, because suicidal person wishes to die because they cannot live the way that they wish to live. And I do think that there's at least 75% truth in that statement. And I do understand it as that, because it's not that you don't want to live. You come to the point where you don't want to live because you can't live the way in which you imagine or picture or feel or want to live. You know, I think that people that have overactive imagination can also have that fear and that slip between, you know, too much consciousness / insanity pipeline when it is unchecked or when it's not realized, right? So that's why a lot of writers will tell you that they write because if they didn't write, they'd go crazy, or they write because they're compelled to write, right? And I think it makes sense to me as my human body, my human character, my real but also could be imagined character, because we're a story within a story within a story, that I chose writing as the avenue. I chose as a person that can play within images and worlds and language to be the representative of what I imagine myself to be and what I can be in this world, in whatever you want to call it, in this world, in this simulation, in this matrix, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I do know that these are incomplete thoughts because I had explained this better. I have a voice memo of me explaining this in a better way, but it's a bit more personal because I was talking to a relative. So yeah, I will come back and I will make a clearer video on this. But I do seriously believe that we are a story within a story within a story. And that does not mean that since we are real, that it's not an imagined story. And it does not mean that if it's an imagined story, that it's not real. And I think, and this will be like a further video that I'll make, I think the way to be in balance and content with your consciousness and with your life, the way that you see your life, the way that you frame your life, and the way that you frame, for example, your relationship or your purpose to this life, is by matching up as close as possible what you imagine yourself to be and what you can actually be in this world, in this limitation. Because like you are Jon Snow limited to a Game of Thrones setting, right? You can unlock the consciousness of this person that understands and that has witnessed Princess Diana, Michael Jackson, and the new Hunger Games books. But you eventually understand that you are confined physically, not really mentally or spiritually, to being Jon Snow in the Game of Thrones world. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I'm confined as Sandra, as this person in this world, in this space right now, filming to you, which again, this is another layer of like distortion in my opinion. I think this is also why I feel sometimes uncomfortable filming, because I'm aware that when I'm filming a video for you guys on either of my channel, I'm aware that I'm framing things, you know. We can throw away these words: authenticity, true self, real self, imagined self, but in the end, because we live in these story frameworks, we know who we are, we know who the people around us are, but it's always limited to the stories we tell ourselves and the stories they tell us, right? It's always a story of a story of a story. And it's funny because the more you think about this, the more you will come into those circles, full circles. And I think I can keep talking this way for hours and hours and hours, but there might not be a point. The whole purpose is that everything is meaningful and meaningless at the same time. Everything is real and imagined at the same time. Everything is a story of a story at the same time. So especially when you read a lot, okay, you realize that everything is in dialogue, right? So if everything is in dialogue, isn't that just one big fucking fat story unraveling at the same time all the time? Like you read Milton based on the Bible, you read Shelley's Frankenstein based on the Prometheus story, then you watch Oppenheimer, which is, you know, based on another Promethean story, but this one is real, for example. And it's just like it keeps unraveling. I think this is what I remember enjoying the most at the same time when I was in school and when I was taking classes of different subjects, how everything interconnected. And you will, okay, the other way to explain it, okay, because I feel like most people have gone through this, is that, you know, when you learn a new word and suddenly you are aware of that word, so you see it everywhere, it's the same thing. I was just reading this book called Night Terrors at the beginning of the year, and it's literally about dreams and nightmares, and it's not really about consciousness. It's just about dreams and nightmares and how we viewed them and how our brains can do crazy stuff in our sleep without us understanding them. And there was this passage that talked about how these people that went to this escapade in the Arctic, and there was 2 ships that were sent and they never came back, but in the collective consciousness of the people that were behind, they were having these dreams about the people on the ship. It was a whole story, and even famous like Victorian writers that we know of have used that in their stories, in their ghost stories, in their Victorian stories. So I was reading that passage, right, and I didn't think much of it at the time that I was reading it, and then I think 2 or 3 weeks later has passed, and I was doing research for one of my books that has to do with like a low-level time travel, and I was reading the book called The Ministry of Time, and this is a fiction book that was published, I believe, a year or 2 ago, and I finally got to read it. And in The Ministry of Time, you won't believe this, it's about a ministry that is saving these people back in time from a big eventual event that will result in their death, okay? And they're taking them and bringing them in current day Britain, right? And they're reacclimating these people, understanding the limitations of the time travel, right? Where they save these people. And one of the main characters that they have been saved is one of those people of that ship that I learned about in Night Terrors. And I didn't even clue that together until after I finished reading the book, and I'm like, why is this so like familiar? Why is the ship name, let me find out the ship name, because so yeah, I just went to go check my notes to find the ship. It was the 19th century Franklin Arctic expedition, which led to the disappearance of naval ship HMS Terror and HMS Erebus. So exactly from that ship, this author uses one of the characters from that ship, real life character, and puts him as a time traveling character in her novel. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it's too conveniently patternized, let's say, for us to not wake up for a second and be like, wait a minute, what's going on? So these are one of the ways that you can see it when you're learning 2 different things, or when you're listening to someone from one field of discipline. Maybe if it's even your parent or someone that you've just encountered, you know, like when you're working somewhere and someone randomly says something, and then the next week someone else says something that these 2 people don't know each other, they're random, right? And they're saying the same thing, or they're talking about the same thing, or you get the clue, okay, from one speech to the other speech to, you know, find what we would call like an experience or a truth between using what you've heard from 2 separate people, and now you know something to be true. This is exactly why we can watch movies, we can dream about us being in that movie, we can, when we have dreams, we feel so connected to these people that we've never met before, and all these little things that like feel unreal, and because they are, and because they're real at the same time, I think it's just insane. I think I remember when I was reading, I think I was 19 or 20. I think it was around after my first year of university, and I was highly depressed. This was after my second attempt. This is another subject that at some point I will be talking about on my channel. I remember thinking, I remember reading actually Sylvia Plath's full journal, and I'm not kidding. You might think this is insane because now that I think about it, it is an insane behavior or reaction to have. But as I was reading Sylvia Plath's journal, especially the first portion when she was around the same age as I was writing her journal, I kid you not, word for word, I have said or felt the things that she has said or wrote about in her journals. Like, this is like really her, right? So much so that whole month that I was reading her journals and like even trying to go back into my old journals to see like, have I said this for word, like what's going on? I literally thought I was like reincarnated. I literally thought like this was the first time in my entire existence where I was like, yeah, you know what? Reincarnation might be real. It actually might fucking be real because I feel like I'm the proof, right? Obviously, as time passed, I don't really... Can I say I don't believe that? Because if I really believed it at one time, I'll say that I had a moment where I really believed that, and I was really conscious of the story within the story within the story, and conscious that like everyone that has ever lived will live and continue to live and has lived. And I don't know where that leads me to, because I've had these progressions between being an atheist but also understanding that there's something at play here. I think the only closest thing that I myself, and again, we could label it whatever you want to label it. If you want to call it paradigm, if you want to call it storytelling, if you want to call it consciousness, if you want to call it pattern recognition, fine, okay? It's all words, it's all images, but you know, at the same time, I can provoke an image in another person's mind, you know? It's not probably going to be the same image, but this is the same thing that, you know, when we're reading stories, we can picture things and we can imagine things, right? Or we can feel things. And I think feeling is also a very direct link, okay, of this consciousness. And feeling is actually setting up the right story for the right person, setting up the right story in the right way, right? For example, going back to Jon Snow, if we set up Jon Snow as this virtuous main character hero going on a hero's journey, and we're rooting for him, when we hurt him, we hurt the people that are reading about him. And this is real hurt. This is real pain. Do you know when we read stories and we feel pain and loss? And I felt it. I felt my heart shatter at reading a story. Can we explain that? Can we explain that? Right? It's because we're... Anyways. I fear that I'm not going to make any more videos like this because it sounds insane. But the way that I had it presented to me felt like the most sane and natural thing ever. And it's something that, you know, like when you learn something for the first time but you don't realize it until you go through it, or you have that lesson a few times. For example, and this is another way that I'm saying like there's a glitch in the matrix, as the common people like to call it, is when, you know, someone has given you the same advice 10-15 times, but you only receive that advice when you're going out traveling or when you're going out doing something different from your normal script, right? Your normal story, and you go out and this random person, sometimes it's even like your idol, like if you go watch an author event by an author that you respect and you never seen them before, but suddenly they say something and it's like it just changed your life, it just changed your narrative, right? It changed. This is why as humans we do certain things that we seem or we deem to be impossible, we make them possible. You know, how do people get through lifelong addictions? How do people get through building new skills at a later age? Like, it's all these things are like magical almost, right? They're magical because it's like translating from the realm of imagination to the realm of the reality, and we are amazed, right? We are amazed at so many little things that can provoke these moments of great profound consciousness and awareness that we are kind of acting in a story within a story. I have listed a few things because I was wanting to expand what I was thinking about. So like I said, traumatic events, life and death moments, sometimes like taking substance like LSD and other psychedelics. What else? Fasting. I think fasting is a great one. Manifesting, reading, traveling, having sex even. I would say sometimes it could happen. And I think there's a few more, but like these are things that, you know, they're kind of like a disruption from the regular pattern or day-to-day life. Usually is when we really get those, like the people like to call it, downloads of consciousness. I haven't watched a video about consciousness, but I've watched like one or two in the past videos of people saying like your life is like a movie, and or like escape the matrix videos. And I think like that's kind of like the way I see it, but I don't see it in that way. I see it more in storytelling, because I also can dream in a way where I am inside a movie or a book or a story, or inside other people, even people, strangers that I don't know at all. And that's where I get this feeling. And actually it's interesting because when I think about how I come up with story ideas and stories, I'm the person inside the person, but I know I'm not that person. And I know I'm just like visiting that person when I see my a character do something, or when a line comes to me, right? And that's why people always say like, you know, they're writing to the muses, or they're waiting for the muses to come to see them and visit them. And you have to be receptive, so you have to be conscious and aware, but you cannot force it. I think when we resist or we show too much resistance or persistence in certain things, it can backfire. But I think if I keep continuing, we could talk about this for 5 hours. I will not finish. So this is something I can actually talk about. Let me know what you think. I think that I will come back and reformulate my thoughts about consciousness and storytelling. But these are the main ideas briefly that I've had. Let me know, what are some stories that you're telling yourself about yourself? What are some stories that you wish you could live in, or you wish you could see yourself in? I'm very curious, because that's an active part of our imagination. And like I said, our imagination is not so separate from us as we believe it to be. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is a maybe never before seen video on Sandra's shelf. I don't know the reception that this video will garner, but that's okay. I'm okay with that, because I felt it to be true, and I felt it that it should be shared. So that's what I did. All right, I'll see you on the next shelf. Bye.